Now, the following story came into my hands quite by chance. Not so long ago, I'd wandered into a second-hand bookshop in Charing Cross Road, and I was about to leave it empty-handed. But on the shelf near the door, my eye fell upon a copy of Hackett's Scrinia Reserata, solidly bound in leather, which I thought was well worth the few shillings which the proprietor was willing to accept for it. I mean, it's not an easy book to come by, and it's of real value to anyone who wants to understand certain aspects of English church history during the first half of the 17th century. When I opened the book at home, a thickish wad of paper fell out, which proved to consist of several sheets of foolscap covered with writing. Now, from the look of the paper, I judged it had been there for at least 30 years. The author had not signed it, and there was nothing to indicate to whom the book had belonged. I think I could make a guess at the neighbourhood to which the story relates, and if I'm right, it shouldn't be difficult to identify the house and discover the name of the tenant. But as he seems to have wished to remain anonymous, he shall do so, at least as far as I'm concerned. The form of the story suggests that he intended to publish it, probably in some magazine, and as far as I know, it has not been printed anywhere. So, this is a document. I belong to one of the numerous middle-class English families which for several generations have followed various professions with credit, but without ever attaining any very special distinction. In our own case, India could almost claim us as hereditary bondsmen. For more than a century, most of our men have made their way there and had served John Company or the Crown in various capacities. One of my uncles had risen to be legal member of the Viceroy's Council. So, when my own term came, I went to India in the civil service, and there I lived for 25 years. Now, my career was neither more or less adventurous than the average. The routine of my work was occasionally broken by experiences which would sound incredible to English ears, and therefore I shall not set them out here. And then just before the time came for my retirement, a legacy made me a good deal better off than I'd ever had any reason to expect to be. And upon my return to England, I found that it would be possible to adopt the life of a country gentleman upon a modest scale, but with the prospect of finding sufficient occupation and amusement. I was never married, and I'd been out of England too long to have any very strong ties remaining anywhere. I was free, therefore, to establish myself where I pleased. And the advertisements in the field and country life offered houses of every description in every part of the kingdom. After much correspondence and after several fruitless journeys, I came upon one which seemed to satisfy all my requirements. It lay about 60 miles north of London upon a main line of the railway. Now, that was an important point because I was a fellow of both the Asiatic and the Historical Societies, and I had long looked forward to attending their meetings with regularity. Now, as a boy, I'd known this neighbourhood slightly, and I'd always liked it, although it is not generally considered what is called beautiful. The house was an old one. It had been a good deal larger, but part of it had been battered down during the Civil War when it was besieged by the parliamentary troops, and it had never been rebuilt. It belonged to one of the biggest landowners in the country, whom I will call Lord Rye. It generally served as the dower house to the family, but there was at that moment no dowager countess, and as Lord Rye was himself a young man then, and both his sisters were married, it was not likely to be wanted for some time to come. Had been unoccupied for nearly 2 years. The last tenant was a retired doctor, and he'd been found dead on the lawn at the bottom of the steps leading up to the garden door. Now, his heart had been in a bad condition for some time, apparently, so that this sudden death was not really surprising, although the neighbouring village, it seemed, did view the incident with some suspicion. One or two of the older people professed to remembering traditions of trouble in the house in previous years. Now, this had made it difficult to get a caretaker, and as Lord Rye was anxious to let again, he was willing to let me take it as an almost nominal rent. In fact, his whole attitude suggested that I was doing him some kind of a favour by becoming his tenant. About 500 acres of shooting generally went with the house, and I was glad to find I could have them at a reasonable price too. And so I moved in at midsummer, and each day made me more and more pleased with my new surroundings. After my years in India, the garden was a particular source of delight to me, but I won't describe it to you in any more detail than is necessary to make what follows intelligible. Behind the house, there was a good-sized lawn that was flanked by shrubbery. On the far side, and this is parallel with the house, ran a splendid yew hedge, nearly 15 feet high and very thick. It came up to the shrubbery at each end, but it was pierced by two archways about 30 yards apart, giving access to a beautiful flower garden beyond. Almost in the middle of the lawn, there was an old tree stump, or what looked like an old tree stump, some 3 feet high. Now, although covered with ivy, it was not at all picturesque, and I told Lord Rye that I'd rather like to take it up. Oh, God, by all means, he said. Yeah, I think I would if I lived here. I think that poor old Riley, he was the last tenant, he intended to put a sundial there, I believe. I think that'd look rather nice, don't you? Yeah, it struck me as a good idea too. So I ordered a sundial from London and arranged that the stump be grubbed up as soon as it arrived. One morning, towards the end of September, I awoke unrefreshed after a night of troubled dreams. I couldn't recall anything very distinctly, but I had seemed to be trying to lift a very heavy weight of some kind out of the ground. Before I could raise it, however, an overwhelming terror had taken hold of me, although I couldn't remember why, and I awoke to find that, in fact, my forehead was covered in perspiration. Each time I fell asleep, this dream repeated itself, although the details did not become any more distinct. And I must say, I was heartily glad when it had become late enough to get up. The day was wet and chilly. I felt tired and unwell, and was moreover depressed by a vague sense of impending disaster. This was accentuated by feeling that it lay within my power to avert the catastrophe if I could only discover what it was. In the afternoon, however, the weather cleared, and I thought that a ride would do me good. Now, I rode fairly hard for some distance, and it was past 5 o'clock before I'd reached my own bounds ditch on my way home. At that particular place, a small wood ran along the edge of the property for about a quarter of a mile. Now, I was riding slowly down the outside of this, and it was perhaps 100 yards from the angle where I meant to turn in, and I noticed a man standing at the corner. Now, the light was beginning to fail, and he was so close to the edge of the wood that at first I couldn't be sure that it was actually a human figure at all, or just an oddly shaped tree stump, which I'd never noticed before. But when I got a little nearer, I saw, no, no, my first impression had been correct. It was a man. He seemed to be dressed like an ordinary agricultural labourer. He was standing absolutely still, and he seemed to be looking very intently in my direction. He was shading his eyes with his hand, so I couldn't make out his face. And before I got close enough to make him out more definitely, he suddenly turned and vanished round the corner of the wood. His movements were rapid, but he somehow gave me the impression, I don't know, of being deformed, although in what precise respect, I couldn't tell. Well, I mean, naturally, my suspicions were stirred, and so I put my horse to a canter. But when we'd reached the corner, he shied violently, and I had some difficulty in getting him to pass it. When we had got round, the mysterious man was nowhere to be seen. In front and on the left-hand side, there was a very large stubble field without a vestige of cover in it. I could see that the man was not crossing this, and unless he'd flown, he could never reach the other side in that time. On the right hand lay the ditch bounding the wood. Now, as is usual in that country, it's both wide and rather deep, and had some 2 or 3 feet of mud and water at the bottom. Now, if the man had gone that way, then he had some very pressing reason for wishing to avoid me, but I could not detect any trace of his passage at that point. Nothing to be done, of course, so I went home, and I decided I'd tell the policeman next day to keep his eye out for any suspicious strangers. However, no attempts are made upon any of my belongings, and when October came, my pheasants did not seem to have been unlawfully diminished. Now, October that year was stormy, and one Saturday night, about the middle of the month, it blew a regular gale. I lay awake long, listening to the wind and to all the confused sounds that fill an old house in stormy weather. Twice I seemed to hear footsteps in the passageway outside. Once I could have almost sworn that my door was cautiously opened and closed again. And when at last I did drop off, I was disturbed by a repetition of my former dream. This time, however, the details were rather more distinct. Again, I was trying to lift this heavy weight from the ground, but now I knew that there was something directly underneath it. Now, what this concealed object might be, I couldn't tell, but as I worked to bring it to light, a feeling began to creep over me that I very much did not wish to see it. Now, this soon, in fact, developed into a horror at the bare idea of seeing it, although I had still no notion what manner of thing it might be. And yet, you see, I couldn't abandon this task. So presently I found myself in the position of working hard to accomplish what I would have given the world to have left undone. Now, at this point, I woke and found myself shaking with fright and repeating aloud the apparently meaningless sentence, "If you'll pull, I'll push. If you'll pull, I'll push." I didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. I mean, besides the noise of the storm, the prospect of a repetition of that dream was quite enough to keep me awake. And to add to my discomfort, a verse from Ecclesiastes ran in my head with dismal persistence. "But if a man live many years and rejoice in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for there shall be many." Well, days of darkness seemed to be coming upon me now, I had to admit, and my mind was filled with a vague alarm. Well, the next day was fine, and after church I thought I'd see how my fruit trees had fared during the night. Now, the kitchen garden was enclosed by a high brick wall. On the side nearest the house, there were 2 doors, which were always kept locked on a Sunday. In the wall opposite, there was a trapdoor, about 3 feet square, giving onto a rather untidy piece of ground, which was partly orchard and part waste. When I'd unlocked the door, I saw, standing opposite the wall, the figure which I had seen at the corner of the wood. I saw now that his neck was abnormally long and so malformed that his head lolled sideways onto his right shoulder in a disgusting and almost inhuman fashion. I mean, he was almost bent double, and I think he was misshapen in some other respect as well, but of that I couldn't then be certain. He raised his hand in what seemed to me a threatening gesture, and then he turned and slipped through the trapdoor with remarkable quickness. I was after him immediately, but upon reaching the opposite wall, I received a shock which stopped me like a physical blow. The trapdoor was shut and bolted on the inside. Well, I tried to persuade myself that a violent slam might have made the bolt shoot, but I knew, in fact, that that was impossible. I mean, I had to choose now between two explanations. Either that my visitor was a hallucination, or else he possessed the unusual power of being able to bolt a door upon the side upon which he himself was not. Now, the latter was, upon the whole, the more comforting supposition, and in view of some of my experiences in India, it was, I thought, probably the more probable. After a little hesitation, I opened the trap, and as there was nothing to be seen, I got through it and went to the top of the orchard where the kennels lay, but neither of my dogs would follow the scent. When I got them to the spot where that man's feet must have touched the ground, they whined and showed every symptom of alarm, and when I let go of their collars, they hurried home in a way which showed plainly what they thought of the matter. Now, this seemed to dispose of the idea of hallucination, and as before, well, there was nothing else to be done but await developments as patiently as I could. And for the next fortnight, nothing remarkable did take place. I had my usual health, and as near an approach to my usual spirits as could reasonably be expected. I had some visitors for part of the time, but no one to whom I could have cared to confide the story at this stage. I was not molested further by day, and my dreams, although varied, were never alarming. On the morning of the 31st of October, I received a letter announcing that my sundial had been dispatched, and it duly arrived in the course of that afternoon. Now, it was heavy, so by the time that we'd got it out of the railway van and onto the lawn, it was too late to place it in position that day. The man departed to drink my health, and I turned towards the house. Just as I reached the door, I paused. A sensation which is familiar to all men who spend a lot of time on their own had come over me, and I felt as if I were being watched from behind. Now, usually this feeling can be dispelled by turning round. And so I turned round, but on this occasion the sense that I was not alone merely increased. I mean, of course, the lawn was deserted, but I stood looking across it for a few moments, telling myself that I must not let my nerves play tricks with me. And then I saw a face detach itself slowly from the darkness of the hedge at one side of the left-hand arch. For a few seconds it hung, horribly poised, in the middle of the opening, like a mask suspended from the invisible thread. And then the body to which it belonged slid into the clear space, and I saw my acquaintance of the wood and the kitchen garden, this time sharply outlined against a saffron sky. I mean, there could be no mistaking now his bowed form and horribly distorted neck. But now his appearance was made additionally abominable by the expression on his face. The yellow sunset light seemed to stream all around him, and he showed me features convulsed with fury. He gnashed his teeth and clawed the air with both hands. I'd never seen such a picture of impotent rage. I mean, it was more by instinct than any deliberate courage that I ran straight across the lawn towards him. And he was gone in a flash. And when I came through the archway where he'd stood, I could see that he was hurrying down the side of the hedge towards the other archway. He moved with this strange shuffling gait, and I was sure that I would soon overtake him. But to my surprise, I found that I didn't gain very much on him. His limping shuffle took him over the ground as fast as I could cover it. In fact, when I reached the point from which I started, I thought I'd actually lost a little. When we came round for the second time, there was no doubt about it. I mean, this was humiliating, but I persevered, relying now upon my obviously superior stamina. But during the third circuit, it suddenly flashed upon me that our positions had become reversed. I was no longer the pursuer. It, whatever the creature was now chasing me, and the distance between us was diminishing rapidly. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit here that my nerve now failed completely. I think that I screamed out loud. I ran on, stumblingly, helplessly, as one runs in a dream, knowing now that that creature behind me was gaining with every stride. I mean, how long the chase lasted, I do not know, but presently I could hear his irregular footstep close behind me, and a horrible dank breath played upon the back of my neck. We were on the sides towards the house when I looked up, and I saw my butler standing at the garden door with a note in his hands. Now that the sight of his prosaic form seemed to break the spell which had kept me running blindly round and round the hedge. I was almost exhausted, but I tore across the lawn, and I fell in a heap at the bottom of the steps. Now, Parker was an ex-sergeant of the Marines, which amounts to saying that he was incapable of surprise, and he qualified to cope with any practical emergency which could possibly arise. He picked me up, helped me into the house, gave me a tumbler of brandy diluted with soda water, and fortified himself with another without saying a word. Now, how much he saw, or what he thought of it all, I could never learn, because all subsequent approaches to the question were parried with the evasive skill which seems to be the birthright of all them that go down to the sea in ships. But his general view of the situation is indicated by the fact that he sent for the rector rather than the doctor, and, as I afterwards learned, he had a private conference with the rector before he left the house. Soon afterwards, Parker joined the choir, or in his phrase, assisted with the singing in the chancel. And for many months, the village church had no more regular or vocal attendant. Now, the rector listened to my story gravely, and he was by no means disposed to make light of it. Something similar, he said, had come his way once before, when he'd been in charge of a parish in the Northumbrian border. He was confident, he said, that no harm would come to me that night if I remained indoors, and he departed to look up some authorities, he said, on certain subjects. Oh, the night was noisy, with wind. And so the insistent knocking, which I seemed to hear during the small hours, at the garden door and the ground floor windows, which were secured with outside shutters, may have had no existence beyond my imagination. I'd asked Parker to occupy a dressing room opening out of my bedroom for the night, and he seemed very ready to do so, but I don't think that he slept very much either. Early the next morning, the rector reappeared, saying that he thought that he'd found a clue, although it was impossible. In 78. On this day, John Croxton, a poor man, hanged himself from a beam within his house. He was a very stubborn popish recusant, and ye manner of his death was in accord with his whole life. He was buried that evening at ye crossroads. Yes. It's unfortunate, said the rector, that we have no 16th century map of the parish, but there is a map of 1759 which marks a hamlet at the crossroads just outside your gate. Now, the hamlet doesn't exist now, of course. I mean, you know that the population hereabouts is much less than it used to be. But it used to be called New Cross. Yes, and I think that must mean that this particular crossroads was comparatively recent. Now, this house is known to have been built between 1596 and 1602. The straight way from Farley to Abbotsholme would lie nearly across its site, I think, therefore, that the Elizabethan Lord Rye diverted the old road when he laid out his grounds, and you see that would also count for the loop which the present road makes. Look, he showed me this on the map. At this point, Parker came in. No, sorry, the vicar went on. Now, I strongly suspect, old fellow, that your visitor was Mr. Croxton, and that he's buried somewhere in your grounds. Now, if we could find a place, I think that we could keep him quiet in the future. But I'm afraid there's just nothing to guide us. And it was at this point that Parker came in. I beg your pardon, sir, he said, but Hardman is wishful to speak to you, sir, about that there stump on the lawn there, what you told him to get rid of. Well, we went out and we found Hardman and his boy looking at a large hole in the lawn. By the side of it lay what we had taken for a tree stump, but it had never struck root there. It was a very solid wooden stake, some 9 feet in length over all, and with a sharp point that had been driven some 6 feet into the ground, passing through a layer of rubble about 3 feet from the surface. At the bottom, this hole widened, forming a large and plainly artificial cavity. The earth here looked as if it had been recently disturbed, but of course the condition of the stake showed that was impossible. Well, it was obvious to both me and the rector that we had come upon Mr. Croxton's grave at the crossroads, and that what had appeared to be a natural stump was really the stake that had been driven through him to keep him down. We told the gardeners to leave the place for the present, as it might contain some interesting antiquities, and so we dismissed them, and soon we'd enlarged the shaft sufficiently to explore the cavity at the bottom. Now, we had naturally expected to find a skeleton or some such there, but in that we were disappointed. We could not discover the slightest vestige of bones or body or dust, except that of natural soil. Once, while we were working, we were startled by a harsh sound. It was like the cry of a nightjar, apparently very close at hand, but whatever it was passed away very quickly, as if the creature which made it was on the wing, and it was not repeated. By the rector's advice, we went to the churchyard and brought away sufficient consecrated earth to fill up the cavity. The shaft was filled up, and the sundial securely placed upon it, the pious mottos with which it was adorned according to custom, assumed for the first time a practical significance. Yet it not infrequently happens, said the rector later, that those who have not received Christian burial are unable or unwilling to remain quiet in their graves, particularly if the interment has been carelessly carried out in the first place. They seem to be particularly active, I found, on or about the anniversary of their death in any year. Now, their range of activities is varied, and it would be difficult to define the nature of the power which animates them or the source from which it is derived. But you see, I incline to think that it's less their own personality than some force inherent in the earth itself, or of which they become the vehicle. I mean, with the exception of vampires, which are altogether, of course, sui generis and virtually unknown in this country, they can seldom do much direct physical harm. They operate indirectly by terrifying, but are commonly compelled to stop there. But you see, it's always necessary for them to have access to their graves. Oh, yes, I mean, if that access is obstructed in any way, then their power seems to lapse. And that is why I think that their vitality is some way bred of the earth. And I'm sure, in fact, that you will not now be troubled by any more visits from Mr. Croxton. Our friend, you see, was afraid that your sundial would interfere with his convenience. And I think he was trying to frighten you into leaving the house. I mean, of course, if your heart had been weak, he might have disposed of you as he did of your unfortunate predecessor. His projection of himself into your dreams was part of his general plan, I think. But I suspect that was an error of judgment. It might have put you on your guard. But anyway, I doubt that he could have inflicted any physical injury upon you if he had caught you yesterday. Yes, I said. Well, you might be right, Rector, but I'm glad that I'll never know. Well, the next day, Parker asked leave to go to London, and he returned with a large picture representing King Solomon, issuing directions to a corvée of demons whom he had, according to a well-known Jewish legend, compelled to labour at the building of the Temple of Jerusalem. This picture he proceeded to affix with drawing pins to the inside of the pantry door. He called my attention to it particularly, and he said that he'd got it from a Jew he'd known in Malta, who'd recently opened a branch establishment in the Whitechapel Road. I ventured to make some comment on the singularity of the subject, but Parker was, as usual, impenetrable. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, "but there's some things what a civilian don't never have a chance of learning, not even if he had the brains for it. Now, I've done my 21 years in the service, and you may learn to it that man there," he pointed out King Solomon, "that man there, sir, he knew his business."